really, to have you here for what is the second in a semester-long series of global salons. These salons are organized by the Einaudi Center, the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies at Cornell University, and under the initiative of Global Hubs at the university. The Global Hubs are Cornell's partners around the world, thinking about strategic partners with whom we're working together on teaching, research, and engagement in order to be able to address global problems with long-term partnerships. So we're thrilled to have these participants here today. We're thrilled to have you in the audience to discuss difficult issues around democratic resilience, democratic strength, and transitions, and to do so together with partners from very different contexts around the world. So welcome and thank you all.
Thanks so much, Wendy, for being here, and to all of our guests, our hosts from all across the world today. It's truly an honor to be here together to take up our topic of democratic change and challenges. And thank you also to all of our audience members for listening in. I want to invite our audience members to share your questions, your ideas, your reactions to what's being said, and your own links to research projects and centers in the Q&A function today. We'll use those in order to further the conversation after we've gone through each of our panelists' introductions, and really to be able to use this entire conversation as a springboard, a launching point for a whole set of next steps in terms of potential collaborations as we launch this thematic topic with our partners from across the globe. I'll be brief because I want to get to each of our experts to briefly explain their work and their university activities, but I want to give everyone a sense of the charge that they've been given. We've asked everyone to briefly introduce themselves, their work, their research, and also to share information about their university, the centers they're involved in that relate to this topic, that are ripe for collaboration. And then thirdly, and perhaps most importantly for our conversation, to engage in a thought experiment about the question, what is the future of this research agenda that could be facilitated by this interdisciplinary, multilateral research collaboration? How could this really be the next step in terms of the next generation of questions and research activities in this thematic area? So thank you so much to all of our hosts for participating, and we'll open it with our first speaker, Dr. Roberts from Cornell University.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ken Roberts from the Government Department at Cornell. I teach comparative and Latin American politics at the university, and I'm a former director of the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Center at the Einaudi Center. And I've been involved in the development of Cornell's emerging global hub with partnership with the Universidad San Francisco de Quito in Ecuador. And so I think it's great that the Einaudi Center is organizing these salons to help us identify some of the important issues that we're all interested in, that we can try to enrich through our relationships with our hub partners. My own particular work in Latin American politics, I basically work on democratic representation and the politics of inequality, broadly conceived. So I do a lot of research on political parties, on social movements, on populism, mostly in Latin America, but increasingly in the United States and Europe as well. Like many scholars of comparative politics of my generation, I began my career essentially studying democratic transitions. How were democratic regimes created after periods of authoritarian rule? I have to confess I'm a little bit surprised at this latter stage of my career to be studying the reverse process. So I've been involved in a lot of debates around questions of democratic erosion or backsliding, the breakdown of democracy, not just in Latin America, but elsewhere in the world. I've been doing a lot of work on issues like political polarization. In fact, I'm engaged in some shared work with Paolo, who will be presenting a little bit later from Universidad San Francisco de Quito, but also working on issues like populism, anti-establishment politics, the erosion of institutional checks and balances under democracy. And I feel very fortunate to be at Cornell working on these issues, not only because we have a lot of strengths in the study of different world regions at Cornell, because this is a topic of importance in many different places around the world. But also Cornell's one of the few major universities in the United States where specialists in the study of US politics are engaged in a meaningful dialogue with those of us who work in other parts of the world to see how can we cross-fertilize our understanding of democracy and learn from each other. And so I feel very fortunate to be part of a group we've created, what we call the American Democracy Collaborative, which is really based here at Cornell, but includes colleagues at other universities as well, that tries to encourage this dialogue between comparativists and Americanists in the study of democracy. We've had a series of workshops and conferences and webinars that Einaudi has helped us to host. We put out a major book, I don't know if you can see this, just came out from Cambridge a couple of months ago, called Democratic Resilience: Can the United States Withstand Rising Polarization? And we're organizing a major conference in May this year that basically does the global version of that. So looking at challenges to democracy in Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, as well as the United States. So that's a conference that's coming up in May, and we hope to produce another book out of that project. Just to try to conclude, let me say that in understanding this topic, we don't see this as just a topic for political scientists. Democratic erosion and challenges to democracy is not just a question of the democratic institutions themselves. We think it's critically important to understand how do economic inequalities shape and distort democratic representation? How do racial and ethnic inequalities play out in the democratic arena? How do they shape the kinds of conflicts you see under democracy? How do different kinds of cultural identities become expressed in the democratic arena? How do they become politicized in the democratic arena? We're also very interested, what lessons can we learn from historical experiences about the kinds of challenges we face today under democracy, and how can our understanding of historical processes of political development help us to understand those changes? So those are the kinds of topics that require other perspectives, not just from political science, but also from other kinds of disciplinary perspectives. And so we see this as a topic that really resonates across different world regions, because these challenges are faced in many different parts of the world. And also we are especially interested in trying to understand, can we make democracy more resilient by making it more inclusive? Are there ways in which we can give more effective voice and representation to different groups within society and use that as a way to help strengthen democracy? So that's what we're involved in here. I'll stop there. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Ken. Fantastic way to start us off. With that, we'll move to Dr. Fierro from Tec de Monterrey. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for this invitation. It's really an interesting and very important opportunity. Well, I actually right now have, like, two hats. One is I oversee the international strategy for the social science school in Tecnológico de Monterrey. Tecnológico de Monterrey is the largest private university in Mexico. We have 15 campuses around the country. I'm right now in Mexico City, has 3 campuses, and I'm in one of those campuses. But we have it, of course, in Monterrey, Guadalajara, and also in the southern part, in Querétaro, Chihuahua, in many campuses. No? And actually, while we are worried right now, one of our goals from now to 2025 is actually enhance the international aspects of our research and of our teaching. I am a lawyer. I've been a law professor of constitutional administrative law for around 20 years now. And I completely agree with Kenneth that the issues of democracy should be seen from a multidisciplinary view. And that's why I've been involved in this. Let me tell you a little bit about my research. Right now, I'm involved in writing this paper with a panel that we worked last year in Law and Society regarding actually the backsliding of democracy and the increase of populist governments around the world. I'm focusing in Latin America, but of course, I think this is a problem that we can see in Hungary, Turkey, Venezuela, and after even in the United States after the 6th of January last year. So what we are thinking thinking is, we started by this Kyle and Monk's 2017 study of 36 populist governments of the 21st century that shows that in these types of governments, there is a 20% more chances of infringement of democracy's institution, and more than 50% of populist leaders reform constitution and weakens the checks and balances of the executive. This reveals the reduction of democracy to the minimum expression, and even it's a de facto elimination of substitution of democracy checks and balances for, the figure of the strong leader like we have today, with López Obrador. So what we are trying to bring to the discussion is what are the accountability mechanisms that we have already in democracies, in governments that are ruled by the rule of law, that can help defend democracy. And we start with Christoser's definition of accountability as the substantive dimension of democracy and part of the overall control of power by Congress and the judicial branch. And this is like what we are trying to concentrate on. No? What can administrative courts and constitutional courts can do in giving voice to people for defending their democracies and their human rights in front of populisms. In Tec de Monterrey, we also have, I only have 1 minute, two big initiatives for research that's called the Transparency Anti-Corruption Initiative, and we have three main lines of research in these aspects, that is access of justice, democracy, corruption, and global affairs. We have one in development and environment, and government and public internship. I will put them in the chat, the links to this research, so you can find it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I love the connection already with what Ken has been discussing and the constitutional and legal framework from your approach. Next, we'll move to Dr. Gyampo from the University of Ghana. Dr. Gyampo, for you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and good to join you. My name is Ransford Gyampo from the University of Ghana. I teach political science here. I've done so for close to 20 years. I, until recently, was the director for the Center for European Studies, where I have served 5 years and handed over the mantle of leadership to another person. I think in terms of research interest, I'm focused more on democratic governance and leadership, electoral politics, electoral reforms, institutional reforms. I'm also talking about focused on inclusive governance, and here I am particularly interested in how young people can be brought into the fray of decision making. We have a practice in Africa where young people are only used as agents meant to foment violent conflict. They are used as party foot soldiers, agents that are just devoted or made to commit themselves to getting votes for politicians, and then afterwards they are just abandoned in the decision-making process. You are wise enough to go get votes for politicians. You are wise enough to determine who must lead you. But when it comes to being part of decision-making, all of a sudden you are described as immature and also inexperienced. How can a population that is relatively youthful continue to marginalize or undermine or relegate to the background the role of its young people in the governance process? So I've been thinking and looking into some of these things. I've also been working on natural resource governance and natural resource management, and I've been publishing extensively in this area. But at the moment, my research agenda and what I'm focusing on now is to do a thorough assessment of democracy in Ghana using the lenses of Abraham Lincoln's definition of democracy as a taxonomy, you would agree with me, or you would remember that in his Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln defined democracy as being government for the people, government of the people, and government by the people. And so my point is to look at these three components of his definition: government for the people, or government of the people, and government by the people. You take each of the components and see how our country, Ghana, has fared. So if you are talking about government of the people, for instance, what does that mean? What are there dividends to be distilled? How have government over the years been of the people? So I want to subject that into critical scrutiny to know whether there is indeed government of the people, and what has government of the people done for the people of Ghana? What are the challenges that continue to plague our effort or our quest to have government of the people? If it is government by the people, I want to look at some indices to determine whether there is truly government by the people. What benefits have accrued to us? Have we had government by the people? And what are the challenges? And then if it is also government for the people, are we really governing, or is there really a process or an act of government for the people? If there is, what are the indicators? What are the benefits? And what are the challenges that we continue?
Okay, I think we might have lost Professor Jumpo for a moment with connection, but in any case, we will definitely bring him back in as we continue the conversation. Thank you so much. And the connections there are very strong as well. Next, we'll move to Dr. Fouad Makki from Cornell University.
Thank you, Rachel. So hi, everyone. My name is Fouad Makki, and I'm on the faculty of the Department of Global Development, and currently serve as the director of the Porsche Institute for Global Development, which is affiliated with the department. I'm also on the board of the Institute for Comparative Modernities, with which I've been affiliated now for over a decade. I'll come back to say a few words about this institute in a couple of minutes, but first, maybe I'll briefly introduce my two main areas of research and how they might relate to the theme of our salon today. So the first is concerned with the processes of decolonization and the transition from a world of empires to one in which the nation state.
Hello.
I think we have.
Yes, Professor Jumpo, we'll come back to you in a minute now. We've just moved to Professor Makki. Thank you so much.
So the transition from a world of empires to one in which the nation state ideal became the norm. And the second one is concerned with the Global Development Initiative that also became institutionalized in the context of decolonization. Now, together, both nationalism and development became in many ways the key ingredients of post-colonial state legitimation. And their connections to democracy proved to be much more complex and contradictory. In principle, democracy, understood as ruled by the demos, has an elective affinity with the idea of the nation conceived as popular sovereignty. But the attempt to conjoin them often generated deep social and political contradictions that frustrated democratic potentialities. In general, you could say there was a general tendency to forms of state sovereignty to substitute for popular sovereignty, and passive obedience to substitute for active citizenship. Similarly, while development was embraced by nationalist leaders as a project only a society liberated from colonialism could accomplish, it soon became an alibi for restricting democratic potentialities, mostly through the argument that democracy required socioeconomic transformations that were essentially beyond popular democratic control. The end of the Cold War and processes of neoliberal globalization have also posed new challenges to democratic self-realization. The very core doctrine of neoliberalism concerning the virtues of the unfettered market essentially removed it from democratic intervention and regulation. Moreover, the liberalization of trade and finance has shifted the relevant frame for economic decision-making from a national to a transnational arena, undermining the institutional vehicles for democratic claims-making. Those institutions of global governance that have increasingly assumed the role of managing the world economy, for the most part, exist in the shadows between nation states and are largely unaccountable to nationally organized electorates. At another level, globalization has also tended to erode the cultural barriers that once shielded national cultures and civic institutions, further dislocating the links between nation and state and unleashing a host of sub- and supranational movements, ethnic, religious, racial, and so on, that have weakened civic and cultural coherence in ways that have undermined democratic capabilities. Now, the connections between national sovereignty, development, and democracy are, of course, much more complicated and uneven than this necessarily very compressed remarks might convey. But I think they do pose a range of crucial questions that invite collaborative interdisciplinary research. For one thing, it is doubtful that we can make much sense of these interconnections within purely national spaces and unilinear temporalities. They are all in different ways overdetermined by the international context, whose determinations, I think, require serious study and reflection. Moreover, while the reality of all these tendencies is not in doubt, it is far from clear they constitute a single irresistible logic. Various countervailing trends have existed and emerged that have promoted new forms of democratic self-assertion and transnational forms of solidarity, particularly around questions of global ecology and inequality. Yet, for all the transformations in the character and capacity of nation states, they still remain the strategic horizons of political action for those who live within them, and for all practical purposes, remain in that sense as germane as ever. So now let me conclude with, by telling you a little bit about the two institutions I mentioned at the beginning. The Porsche Institute for Global Development was established in 2001 to advance research on issues related to global development by sponsoring seminars, workshops, research working groups, and providing small seed grants to facilitate collaborative research. It also sponsors a visiting faculty program that has helped to foster institutional linkages and collaborations. The Institute for Comparative Modernists, which is the other institute I'm affiliated with, it also addresses the transnational scope of the modern and its entanglements with colonialism and capitalism, putting particular emphasis on social and cultural transformations, as well as emergent critical epistemologies from the global south. It too seeks to galvanize research in these areas through symposia, seminars, a lecture series, and occasional publications. If you're interested in learning more about either of these institutions, please feel free to contact me or go and visit their respective websites, which I can also put on the chat function. All right, well, thank you for that. I don't know if I've exceeded my time or under time. But
Thank you so much, Fouad. Perfect. And to Professor Jumpo, we'll come back to you as we circle back at the end, but I'm going to continue in order here, but we'll return to you for those closing ideas of the future agenda setting at the end. Next, we'll move to Professor Ramaswamy from Jindal University. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'm the Dean of the School of Government and Public Policy in the Jindal Global University, which is a very young university that started in 2009. My school started in 2012 in public policy. It's the first program in the country in India that offered a master's degree in public policy. Now we have an undergraduate degree as well. And that's because public policy, unlike in North America, in countries like the Commonwealth and India, has been a monopoly of the civil service. I should mention that our early Indian civil service officers were trained in the college that I went to in Oxford, where I picked up a limerick about its master, which describes, even to this day, a mindset of our civil servants and policymakers, which is, first come I, my name is Jowett. There's no knowledge, but I know it. I am the master of this college. What I don't know isn't knowledge. Now, this has been a mentality of our civil service, but that's changed. Now government is willing to listen and outsource research and analysis to other institutions, to universities, think tanks, which opened the ground for having a school of public policy where we train people in public policy. But my interest in democracy has been much longer. When I worked in the Ford Foundation, I supported a project done by York University in England called Terms of Political Discourse. And this was an attempt to understand what we need, a vocabulary or concepts and categories to capture the reality of democracy in different parts of the world. It's not the same. Representation of a member of parliament in India is not what Edmund Burke told the electors of Bristol what he's going to do as their representative. It's completely different. So if you use the same term, representation, it doesn't capture or convey what is it that the member of parliament or a member of a legislative assembly in India is doing, although it's called representative democracy and is it representative. Now, I think this is an unfinished task. I think we need to continually explore to get the language correct for this. Then I was involved in the UNDP after the Ford Foundation in its human development reports, particularly the one in 2002, which was about deepening democracy, where Amartya Sen made a statement that earlier we were concerned about how to make countries fit for democracy. What are the preconditions for democracy? And his argument was that countries should become fit by being democracies, right? So, and then I set up the Oslo Governance Center, again concerned about democratic governance. And now my main interest is not so much in political science. I mean, I did get a degree in political science in Oxford and then went on to work on constitutional law. And I'd say that one of the important things that we are now concerned about is the fact that democracy doesn't really deliver basic goods and services to the extent that you would expect. The majority of the people who are poor in India, for instance, don't vote on a platform or a mandate that says, except once in 1971, and once again when the BJP government claimed that India is shining, the electorate responded by defeating the government, saying, no, India is not shining. Except for these two general elections, our elections are always about, now currently, it's about Hindu and Muslim. It's about a kind of populism that's projected by one party and the degeneration of other national parties, the Communist Party and the Indian National Congress. So there's degeneration of parties on the one hand. There is a kind of populism that's coming into governance, which is anti-plural. That's how I define it. Yes, they could say that, we are talking about the people and so on. So therefore, I'm very, very keen to advance this project that I've been involved in from the time I started with Terms of Political Discourse, to get a better understanding of what is happening in democratic process. I've stopped thinking of China as not democratic because I worked in the UNDP. I went to China. I know that at the local level, the Communist Party of China makes sure that those who govern a locality are accountable and satisfy the people in that locality. And if they don't do that, they throw them out. We have very good instruments to get feedback from citizens. The Bangalore report card is one, but having used the Bangalore report card and showing that democracy has not delivered, the corporation has not is not accountable to the people. No single person in the Bangalore Corporation has ever been penalized, transferred, punished in any way, whereas it happens in China. So when the Chinese say, how do you say we are not democratic? You know, if it's accountability of the rulers to those whom they rule, we have it. So I think we need to have a much more subtle understanding, not simply use the standard language that is there in textbooks that come from the West. We need to figure out the diversity of democracy and the democratization of our democracy understanding. That's what I'd like to do and collaborate with others if possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There are real connections, that are developing in terms of Ken starting us out with a discussion of making democracy more inclusive, and that way in which that's continuing through amongst the comments from youth to different types of categorical identities and the like that many of you have been raising. Next, we're going to move to Dr. Paolo Moncogata from University de San Francisco de Quito. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen because I did prepare a presentation, a very brief presentation for this. Could you please confirm that you can see it? Okay. So good morning, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here and share with all of you and learn from all of you. My name is Paolo Moncogata, and I am professor of political science at Universidad San Francisco de Quito in Quito, Ecuador. In case there's any of you who don't know where we are located, this is it. We are a private liberal arts university located right on the equator in the South American Andes, and we'll be happy to host you whenever you come visit us. My main research interests have to do with citizen attitudes towards politics in general and towards democracy in specific. Also, I am interested in democratization and de-democratization processes, electoral behavior, and Latin American politics in general, I would say. Currently, my main focus is on the intersection of public attitudes towards democracy and the quality of democratic systems. In specific, I am interested in how different types of political polarization processes take place, be it affective polarization, ideological polarization. I am interested in looking at polarization as a dependent variable, trying to identify and unravel its sources, but also as an independent variable and assessing its effects. One of the principal questions guiding my research now is to assess if political polarization produces democratic backsliding of any sort. One of the projects I'm currently working on, and Ken mentioned it when he at his speech, starts with the development of an ideological polarization index at the citizen level using public opinion data to then analyze trends and patterns of ideological polarization occurring in Latin American countries in the last 2 decades. For this, I have based my operational definition on a very straightforward conception of polarization proposed by Maurice Fiorina, which states that polarization is a movement from the center toward the extremes with a tendency toward increasing bimodality. And this is very important for what I am working on, the bimodal assumption. And if that is how polarization would be defined, this is what polarization would look like. It's a dynamic process, a movement, where the center of a given ideological scale loses toward both extremes of the scale. What I'll show you next is just some very brief examples of what I'm working on and what I found thus far. I've divided people in 3 categories based on public opinion data, on ideological self-identification. So first I have those who qualify themselves as extreme leftists, then those who qualify themselves as moderates, and that includes moderate left, center, or moderate right, and then extreme rightists. Based on this, I have started looking, this is pooled Latin American data. So I first look at what percentages of people qualify themselves as moderates. And as you can see, there's a significant drop in the last decade of people who qualify themselves as moderate. I also look at people who qualify themselves as extreme rightists or extreme leftists. And you can see here that the important change is on the extreme left. And based on this, I calculate these polarization scores, which is the index I'm developing. I already presented some of this. Well, you can see here that there's a very clear trend of increasing ideological polarization in Latin America. I was saying that I already presented some of this in the APSA conference in Seattle last year and got some very useful feedback. So right now I'm in the process of incorporating those suggestions and refining my work. But you will see that this is an initial step in what I'm working on at the moment. Besides this project, which is concentrated on polarization, I'm also working on projects that have to do with ideology of political elites in Latin America. In specific, I'm interested in understanding the nature of the new right-wing parties and movements that are emerging and have emerged in the region, and the effects different types of right wings may have on their political systems. That would be it for me. Thanks for your attention, and sorry if I ran a bit over time. I have no idea.
Thank you so much, Paolo. Fantastic. So we really see a lot of connectivity in your themes and work. Next, we're going to move to Dr. Muntabor from Global Cornell University. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Vitit. It's a bit ironic. I don't quite see myself as an academic, actually. I didn't intend to be. I was on the verge of hitchhiking around the world when coincidentally I came back and became an academic in Thailand. So I tend to see myself as a development catalyst, and it's what I try and do. I interlink with different disciplines, activities locally, regionally, and internationally, even though I do publish internationally and locally on law and more. So number one is I am a lawyer. I have degrees from Oxford in Belgium, but I'm not totally a lawyer. I don't see myself like that. I don't want to be. I want to be something more. So I link up with lots of other disciplines. I have a conference next week with the political science and development faculty on responsibility to protect, which is to do with protecting people in regard to their basic rights if the state fails to do so. I also help with different activities locally. I'm not just an academic. I help NGOs free. I do a lot of pro bono work. And before you came on, I was with PILNet, which is a pro bono global network to prepare for the next pro bono training with pro bono lawyers and so on. And I write for the media, particularly the Bangkok Post and previously The Nation. And then finally, I coincidentally, apart from helping locally and nationally and regionally with ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in various capacities, I help the UN. So for the past 30 years and more, I've helped the UN. I was the UN Special Rapporteur on the sale of children. I was UN Special Rapporteur on North Korea. I was the UN independent expert on sexual orientation. I was the chair of the UN Commission Inquiry on Ivory Coast, and then a member of the Commission Inquiry on Syria. And now I'm the UN Special Rapporteur on Cambodia. And of course, democracy fits into all that. So that's in brief. And if you want to see my literature, it's very humble. my latest book is on challenges of international law in the Asian region. I'm doing the next report for UN Cambodia, which is much to do with elections. My next book I'm preparing now, pro bono, copyright given to the university to help out, will be on ASEAN, Southeast Asia, and warfare, international humanitarian law. So just a volunteer, really.
Thank you so much, Vitit. I think, again, the connections in terms of thinking about the multidisciplinarity, even as Fouad was laying out the legal to the state to the development agenda and the like. Next, we'll move to Gili Vidan at Cornell University.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for sharing your research agenda. It's so interesting to hear about. I'm an assistant professor in the information science department here at Cornell at the newly formed Bowers College of Computing and Information Science. So my background is not as a political scientist, but it's also actually not as an information or computer scientist. I am a historian of technology and a science and technology studies researcher by training. So STS is a field that I think looks at questions at the core of technocracy and democracy, and is starting from the assumption that we have centuries of theorizing the mechanisms through which the few can and should govern on behalf of the many. And STS is trying to apply similar questions and develop a similar sort of robust theorization of the mechanisms through which the few know and develop technology on behalf of and for the many. So my starting point at entering questions about democracy and looking at technology is that technology is always about politics and the appropriate distribution of power in society. In my own work, I look at these very broad questions, but looking at the changing nature of trust through the intermediation of digital technology. So how people come to trust specific platforms or technological objects, as well as how they trust institutions and communicate with others through this technologies of authentication and access control and communication. I'm fairly new to Cornell, as well as to the field of information science, as I said, so this gives me a bit of an outsider's perspective on what I see is happening in the space so far. Here, I think there's a lot of both anxiety as well as enthusiasm around what AI, what artificial intelligence is doing to our understanding of sort of a collective shared experience of media, and the idea that AI-generated media can create things like deep fakes and misinformation, which are challenges to democracy. I guess this is a way to plug the forthcoming Salon in April on big data and AI, where some of my colleagues, Morna Aman at Cornell Tech, as well as others who look at these questions of how do people trust AI-generated speech, for example, will be speaking more. In my own work, I have a research group called the Fake Lab, which stands for Fidelity, Authenticity, and Knowability in Electronic Media, where we are trying to actually apply interpretive social science and qualitative methods to study these questions of fakeness and develop an understanding of how people perceive their sort of digital environment with this assumption of potential mistrust and potential erosion of a shared understanding. So we are trying to develop a series of case studies that we can see as sort of parable or precursors to our current moment of dealing with misinformation. One example of that is the development in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s of a series of technical and regulatory interventions into reprographic technology, so color printers and photocopiers and Photoshop as a software to make sure that you couldn't reproduce fake objects, and namely one particular infrastructure for shared trust, which is banknotes. And I think that these kind of projects raise a lot of questions about the nature and power of the state to sort of enforce its responsibility to its citizens. What are the particular skill set that are expected of citizens in this technologically mediated world? And it also relates to a lot of the previous comments that technology is often seen as the thing that undermines the ability to think of the nation as this bounded, imagined community. it highlights sort of this interdependence of different governing regimes. So thank you for that.
That's fantastic. So many connections, right, to the legal and regulatory side, even as Dr. Ramaswamy was talking about what are public servants and what bureaucratic and administrative zones do they employ, and how that relates to the management of technology and trust and polarization. Fantastic. Next, we're going to move to Dr. Shishua from the University of Zambia. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So my research at the moment focuses on the political role of the military in Southern African politics since the transition to multi-party democracy in the early 1990s. We often think of the military as a stumbling block to democratization, and that was true in the period leading up to the 1990s, when we had several military seizures of power across the continent. And there's a lot of scholarly work on the interaction between the military and politics in Africa, but much less in recent years. And that does not mean that the army is unimportant. Rather, the scholarly neglect that we have seen in recent years is a result of the decline of formal military rule in most parts of the continent. But it's also a result of an unwillingness by researchers to look beyond formal political institutions and processes, and the emphasis on civil society as the good guys. So these factors have contributed to a situation where researchers, mainly political scientists, appear to have stopped taking the military seriously as a political actor in African politics, except in countries like Zimbabwe and South Africa in the late apartheid period. And yet a strong case can be made about the military's involvement in democratic politics under the multi-party era in countries where the latter national armies were not offshoots of the Liberation Army, and B, where the nationalistic struggle was not prolonged. And there are two countries in Southern Africa, which is my focus in terms of where I conduct research. Two countries that offer useful case studies in this regard, and that's Zambia and Malawi. In both countries, preliminary evidence shows that the military repeatedly refused to intervene at key historic moments in support of the incumbent president or one political faction over the other. This refusal allowed political actors to compete for power on the constitutional terrain, and it paved the way for peaceful transfers of power or successful political transitions in both countries. And so the question that I'm grappling with, which brings together history as well as political science, is when, how, and why does the army in Africa intervene in politics under the era of multi-party democracy? I'm still conducting fieldwork in Malawi and Zambia on this question, and the output will hopefully be an interdisciplinary publication that is expected to contribute to wider debates on whether democracy in Africa survives on the strength of formal institutions, or is the result of mass support for democratic processes and outcomes. But it's also expected to contribute to the question of how the military remains an important political actor since they turned to multi-party politics, but may in some cases be more likely to secure rather than undermine democratic gains. There has been this focus on the military as simply a stumbling block, but what we do miss in the process are the ways in which the military actually continue to intervene in ways that secure democratic consolidation rather than undermine democracy in a number of African countries, and which might explain why we are seeing increased alternation or the routinization of leadership change and the reduction in the power of incumbency across the continent. And what I try to do is to really work with colleagues from political science, because I'm a historian. I think that an interdisciplinary analysis of this question can yield significant insights that are likely to enhance our understanding of the decline of core attempts across the continent, but also most importantly, the ways in which the military is actually an important actor in terms of democratic consolidation. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Joshua. Wonderful. And I also just want to give a reminder to our audience to submit questions, links, chats, reactions in the Q&A function, and we'll bring those in as soon as we wrap up with our remaining 3 presentations. Next, we'll move to Dr. Pennington from King's College of London.
Hello, I'm Mark, and it's very nice to be here. So I'm the director of the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society at King's, which is part of the Department of Political Economy. We're the only Department of Political Economy in the UK, and we're based explicitly on an interdisciplinary mission which seeks to bring together economics, politics, and political philosophy into a dialogue, and that engages debates in both positive and normative theory. So the department was founded in 2010. I was the chair of the department between 2016 and 2020. And during that time, we've gone from just having 9 faculty members up to having 65 faculty members today, which is really quite a prodigious level of growth. So within that context, my centre is concerned specifically with the operation of rules of governance, both inside and outside of democratic settings, and the interdependencies between different levels of rulemaking. The centre was founded in 2018, and our first project explored the legacy of Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom's work on the importance of polycentric and bottom-up governance institutions to various social problems, from ecological governance to crime prevention, and the extent to which these forms of governance are facilitated by, or in some circumstances compromised by, democratic structures. We've recently started work on a new project, the political economy of knowledge and ignorance, the focus of which is to explore how much knowledge and what type of knowledge citizens need to make effective decisions, and to reflect critically on what constitutes effective decision-making in both democratic, civil, and commercial settings. We're exploring the way in that knowledge and ignorance are conceptualized and evaluated in social science, and how those evaluations affect power relations in different settings. Ignorance is, for example, often used as a justification for various forms of elite rule and for limiting civil and democratic freedoms. We're hosting a conference in conjunction with colleagues in the law school at King's to explore if and to what extent this has played out in the context of the varied governance responses we've seen to the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the exciting things about King's is the focus on interdisciplinary work and facilitating conversations across fields. An excellent example of this is a project I'm involved in at the moment with the Centre for Attention Studies. This is a new research centre bringing together colleagues from across social sciences, arts and humanities, and the health schools to examine questions associated with the attention economy. It's exploring how the proliferation of information sources and channels associated with new digital technologies are affecting the way in which people allocate their time and the implications for mental health and conditions such as ADHD. More broadly, in terms of thinking about the relationship of attention economies to democracy, we're looking at whether concerns about information overload and misinformation in today's democracies are no different from the kind of moral panics that have occurred in the past following various media innovations, or whether there's something qualitatively and quantitatively different about the effects of the new attention economy and how it's affecting the operation of democratic systems. So there's a lot going on here, and I hope I've given you a flavor of what we do.
Fantastic, Mark. Thanks so much. Obvious connections. I keep coming back to Dr. Ramaswamy's limerick about what public servants know, but certainly connections as well with Dr. Vidan and others. Next, we'll move to Dr. Gil Bernier from Ashoka University. Thank you, Gil.
Thank you very much. So I am from Ashoka University, which is a private liberal arts college in India, and I'm Professor Ramaswamy's direct neighbors. We're 15 minutes apart from one another. So I work on the politics of representation in India in a socio-historical perspective. I work on political parties, but more particularly, I work on India's political class and public elites at large. I look at the representation trajectory of various groups, caste, religious minorities, women in elected assemblies at the local, state, and national level, and across major public institutions, including the police, the judiciary, and the Indian Administrative Service. I draw cross-state comparisons, study what are the institutional, social, and political hurdles to substantive inclusion of vulnerable groups within what we could call public elite institutions. This is primarily a data collection and data production effort because we do not have existing public data set on this. So everything is built almost from scratch through a variety of primary sources and archives across state and state assemblies in India, and through field work to collect data on caste, on political family affiliations of candidates to elections, and so on. So that data is integrated by a multidisciplinary team of data scientists using computational methods to build data sets that are released in open access format. So all the data that I produce or that we produce is immediately released in open access. And we also work on disseminating the data through the data visualization tools. This work, I hope, and I think is useful because India's public elites have been understudied precisely because of the lack or absence of good data. There is focus on political leadership, but not so much on public elites at large, including elected representatives. One question I'm interested in is studying the universe of constraints in which public elites operate and how these constraints affect the functioning of institutions. To just give you one very quick example, politicians in India have extraordinarily short careers. In the current National Assembly, the Lok Sabha, 83% of MPs are first-time MPs, and that number is a constant through time. And so that creates a professional political class that is extraordinarily small for a country of 1.4 billion. Imagine that there are only 12 women in parliament who have been elected more than twice. And so this work, I hope, is also useful because it enables scholars to connect various layers of institutions of representation. So we have attributed a unique identification number for every candidate who contested any kind of election in India back to 1962 that enable us to look at the trajectories of all these candidates. How many contestants at state level, local level, state level end up contesting in national elections. That also enables us to measure party defections, individual incumbency, study the carry patterns of elected representatives. And so all this work consists in building the empirical evidence that we need, the data that we need to build a number of research projects linked to women representation, Muslims representation, caste-based representation. And so that data is also used to explore those questions more qualitatively through fieldwork and engagement with those public elites. And so just to conclude, all the work that we do, or that I do, is by definition collaborative because we building, data set with, hundreds of thousands of individuals. And so we are currently participating in a number of collaborative projects that help us study representation, that help us monitor also activities of candidates to elections on Twitter, to help Twitter monitor hate speech during campaigns. And we collaborate with a lot of the political scientists, but also computer scientists, data scientists, and we affiliate a lot of students and PhD students from universities abroad who can use us as a home institution and a resource base when they study in India. And obviously we welcome more and more of these collaborations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. And last but not least, Mabel Berezin from Cornell University.
Thank you, Rachel. Can everyone hear me? I'm always worried about sound. Okay. Thank you for including me in the salon and Rick Lee for organizing it. And I'm going to follow very deliberately and I hope parsimoniously the script that Rick provided. First of all, I'm Mabel Berezin. I'm professor of sociology here at Cornell, and I'm director of the Institute for European Studies. My academic training is as a comparative and historical sociologist with an emphasis on right-wing politics. And I do work which many can classify as political science. My methods are different in that I analyze texts, narratives, and I take what I call a historical approach to the present. So many times when people hear me speak, they ask if I'm a historian. I particularly focus on the lens of events. Up until, well, at this point, it's been about 10 years. A lot of my work was considered outlier to what people were mainly interested in political science and sociology and history. And obviously that has completely changed. I'm just going to briefly go through what I call the 5 streams in my research and writing that is connected to the democratic challenge in various ways. My first stream of work was on historical fascism in Europe, particularly Italy. My second stream was on contemporary right-wing politics or populist politics in Europe, particularly between 1990 and 2007. And until lately, that really meant right-wing parties. And my original work on that was a deep dive into Italy, contemporary Italy and France. What I've been focusing on lately is what I call the trans-European trend to right-wing populism, which I date more or less to 2014, 2012. And it is this current large project that I've been working on. There are many articles, and I'll put up my website so you can read anything that you'd like to read if you want to dig deeper into that. I've begun to sort of shift my vision from populism to from labeling things as populist to sort of exploring the notion of illiberalism as a political concept. And the last thing that I never thought I'd be working on is the connection between United States politics and European fascism and populism of the past. So this is completely new and somewhat stunning to me. And in some ways, my own research agenda has kind of looped back to where I began, which again is very stunning. I do some collateral work on political and cultural communication and economics and emotion. So that's where I've been. Institutionally, I'm director of IES. I'm part of this wonderful Einaudi Institute. And we are really beginning to sort of explore ways that we could come up with different kinds of working groups and connect to the larger themes. Oops, 1 minute left. All right, I'm going to skip that. I'm going to move to what the other thing that Rick asked us to do, and our thought experiment. What do we see the future? Where do we see the future? Most of this is from my experience with Europe. First, the obvious, we would not even be having this conversation if right-wing politics and populism, or whatever you want to call it, has not become a global phenomenon. So again, I said the obvious, compare, and that's very much what we need to do. And we need to compare across regions, cultures, territorial borders, and probably even time periods. So I said I have a bit of the historian in me. Second, there are trends that I see in European cases that I think should inform our collective research. One of which is, I think, is the kind of flattening of I'm calling it flattening for want of a better word, in that it's becoming harder to distinguish between the sort of left, right, and the center within institutionalized politics, and how a lot of politics has moved to the borders in this, or the non-institutionalized forms. And I'm thinking of things like the yellow vests in France, and the movement towards vaccination that's all over Europe right now. So there's a new kind of politics, I think, that we might consider, and we might think about think about our categories of anti-democracy. Third, and I see a potential connection here to the attention studies, it's almost become a truism that people write that the tension is between cultural nationalism and economic protectionism, and this is what's driving all this right-wing stuff. But the truth is, by virtue of citizenship law, everybody's some form of a nationalist. And it's really time to sort of, pull apart that relationship a little bit more carefully, and also to sort of draw in, what is the role of economics and culture in this whole thing. If I had more time, I'd add two, or if Rick hadn't said three, I'd add two more that have been mentioned. One, the media landscape, fake news, how that works across different places. And lastly, which has come up in many of the commentators, is the legal framework and the legal institutions, constitutional law. I was surprised at the number of lawyers that are here, but I think that's really important. And I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mabel. Thank you to each and every one of our presenters here. And I welcome reactions and questions from the audience. We'll be able to take those up now. And I will also ask Professor Jumpo if he would like to do that agenda setting, the future questions piece, number 3, about what are, as Mabel has just done, what are the questions we should take up together?
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, there was a little hitch with my internet connection, and so I couldn't conclude my presentation. But maybe, first of all, to conclude, well, I just want to say that if we say government of the people, it has meaning. It essentially means representation of the people through elections, through vetting of ministers, through appointments. It's also about elections, whether directly or through other representative mechanisms, to ensure that people are selected to govern, for the to constitute a government, who would rule on behalf of the people. And that's how we have government of the people. And if you have government of the people, what are the indicators? Now, if we find the indicators, we would want to be able to see whether these indicators fits in well with what the situation pertains in Ghana. If you say government by the people, it's essentially talking about participation. So are there sources or channels of participation? How have these served as well? And what are the challenges? If you talk about government for the people, essentially it's about the direct dividends of democracy. How well has democracy worked for our people? What are the dividends? What are the advantages? And what are the challenges? So I'll be looking at all these things. But the next line of question in terms of how this collaboration will help will be, for me, listening to the various presentations, I have a feeling that there are best examples of how democracy has fared in many countries, given the presentations that I've heard. And so getting these best examples will help me to compare and contrast what is happening in my country, so that I can be able to make emphatic statements about whether there's been government of the people, government for the people, and government by the people in my country. And based on that, I'll be in a position to also proffer recommendations as to the mechanisms or the kinds of things that can be done to make democracy work better in my country, and then other parts of Africa.
Thank you so much, Professor Jumpo, and to each of you. So I'm going to just highlight a few themes that I think you really emerged in from all of your comments, and I welcome you each to, just raise your hand and jump in and do the same in our remaining minutes. The first is really between the relation of inclusion and democracy, the resilience of democracy, who takes part in the democracy and how they do so, and what outputs it has in terms of some of the concepts even that Fouad was raising, for example, related to development writ large or sovereignty, and for whom and how it's conceptualized. The second, I think there's so many ways in which, as you're saying, there's talk about information, knowledge, accountability, the role of the media, certainly, but also who are the audiences of what types of information, different forums, different platforms, different channels. And so how does that connect us into projects of governance or disruption? And thirdly, to take up Mabel's point, how has politics moved to what we might call borders? Here, Shashua was discussing the role of the military. Is that a non-institutionalized form, and what are the consequences? How do we think about categories of what we might have considered anti-democratic and question those or put those into a critical framework? And also question what we might have thought of as democratic actions and what their consequences are. So those are three that I have heard, and I welcome your thoughts as well about the points of connection. Yes, Dr. Ramaswamy.
Yeah, I think we need to put our heads together to get a better grasp of what to do about what is described as populism or democracy dying through democracy, right? Through majoritarian politics. What should be the responses to this? I think we need a more sophisticated understanding of why it is that there are leaders like Narendra Modi or Erdogan in Turkey, or previously Donald Trump, who may well come back, and the challenges faced by Trudeau with the truckers. I mean, what are the, there is a sense in which there's a group of people in a democratic polity who say, we are more authentic representatives of the people, and we are the real people, right? And we have, very plural societies, lots of diversities. Now, how to deal with this situation is the dilemma, because this is such a powerful kind of ideological stance that a political party might take, that it's got the potential to subvert democracy, all of the institutions, the checks and balances that there are in a democracy. And so this is a real, and it's what you might call in US constitutional law, a clear and present danger. And how are we to save democracy from this danger? I think ought to be a collective intellectual enterprise, figuring out, I mean, it's no point in simply dismissing the populists and saying, oh, they are populists, they are, and to pretend to have a high moral ground. No, they connect with people, and they connect with the sentiments of people. They exclude minorities. In the case of India, it's been a consistent campaign to marginalize the Muslims, calling upon history, whatever. But I think we need to be able to intelligently counter this. And so I'd like, the Salon after this to somehow initiate a program where we examine how to counter. It's not possible just to say, oh, no, these are all bad people. They don't understand human rights. They don't respect minority rights. They think that, they are the people. They excluding others. All of that kind of moralistic statements against them won't work, don't work. But then how are we to counter the real danger they present to democracy? This is what I'd like to see happen.
That's a wonderful point. And this is really, the point of our coming together in this salon is to set out agendas that we can work together in a collaborative, interdisciplinary, truly global framework. And so just to let everyone know, for our audience and our participants, we will follow up from the conclusion of this salon by sharing the links and creating a forum where we can continue to exchange and chart out these next steps in terms of subtopics and themes to take forward. Biti, you will be our final comment. Thank you so much. Sorry, you're muted.
According to The Economist, in the past 3 weeks, over 50% of the world's states are non-democratic, and the space is shrinking. And a big proportion of the non-democratic countries are in Asia, although we love India and we love Indonesia in a certain sense, but the majority are non-democratic. And the most populous continent happens to be Asia. So I think the challenge is really to address ourselves to the question of ambivalence. How do we have some niches, entry points in that situation of ambivalence? So I just thought I'd pose to myself 3 or 4 elements which might be useful for discussion. One is, even if it's rather non-democratic in that ambivalent setting, what are some of the checks and balances we might look to? And ultimately, we can't just depend upon the national setting, because there is no protection, there is no remedy, there is no accountability very often. Classic case, Myanmar at this point in time, after the coup d'etat, now disintegrating into civil war. So the checks and balances have to be looked at as to what's available nationally, locally, regionally, maybe ASEAN, a little bit, not much, and internationally, whatever we can do to the best of our ability. And in the UN human rights framework, of course, we do have some mechanisms, very modestly, that advocate on behalf of victims. And sometimes it works, you know, some political prisoners are released due to that advocacy. Secondly, in that ambivalence, and when we look for resiliency, what are the leverages that we can look to? Not just carrots and sticks necessarily, but what's in between, and given the context of a given point in time and a given group, a given problem. So I think that's very fascinating, particularly leverages when there's protection deficit and democracy deficit and development deficit and security deficit at the same time, human security. Thirdly, I'm always very intrigued by the constituencies behind the non-democrats or the warring parties and how we can leverage with them a bit. So who are the constituencies, particularly some of the very big powers who exercise the veto, which shall remain nameless. But still, I mean, we can't neglect the constituencies and how we can sort of impact upon them a little bit. So how do we sort of bridge build a bit to have them moderate or modulate what they do? Fourthly, even if it's a very ambivalent situation, there are always niches where you can work. I mean, even if in Southeast Asia, it's difficult to talk about political rights, freedom of expression, association, it's still very possible to talk about some child rights related issues. The Ministry of Education is still more amenable than the Ministry of Security, so to speak. And so we have to be aware of that contextually. And then finally, you know, when all the levels are so dysfunctional, I'm intrigued by the possibility of diminished dysfunctionality. How do we reduce the dysfunctionality? And maybe we need to look at this also in terms of the power relations with which we have to deal. So it's not just democracy or human rights and development and peace, but also how do we try to constrain somehow abuse of power and the monopoly that uses it instrumentally? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I just want to close, because we are at time, by saying that this is the beginning of a conversation and that you have all really germinated in a wonderful way. And we will follow up with not only our panelists, our hosts here today who have shared, but also with our audience members so that you can continue to stay involved. Thank you all so much. And you'll be hearing from us regarding how to take this research agenda forward together. Thank you all very much. Take care.
Rachel, I just wanted to say one word to Vidit. You know, there's a line in Bertolt Brecht which says, you know, power comes from the people, but then where does it go? And that's what Vidit wants us to inquire.
Very well put. A perfect line to end on. Thank you all.